I want to ask you a little bit about what you're working on. So tell the people.
Yeah, sure. So I started a new PhD program in the fall. I left my old one. Um, that was fun. But so I'm switching into the field of cultural evolution. So the question of how is it that cultures change over time, and what are some of the mechanisms underlying it? And one thing I've become recently interested in is innovation. So you look around us and we have all kinds of nice things. Um, we have our computers, we have our microphones. I have a cell phone. I probably shouldn't. We have washing machines, all kinds of different things. And the question is how did we get that, and how do we get more of it? Um, we know, like right now, science in many ways is going through diminishing marginal returns. So for each dollar spent in science, we're getting less and less out of that dollar in terms of research productivity. So, for example, money that went into heart research 30 years ago prevented, X amount of heart attacks over a certain amount of time. But as we've, gone further and further, as we've kind of filled out the idea space, as we've learned more things, maybe as we've gone down certain paths of knowledge to the exclusion of others, kind of like we were talking about with evolution recently, it might be the case that we're losing our productivity in a way. And so I'm wondering, what is it about the way that, say, organizations or groups of people and the ways in which they're organized, which leads to even more innovation?
Hmm. Well, so I have some interesting questions for you there. Actually, that is perhaps not coincidental. Actually, our very first conversation together, which was happened to be the very first show of
Hmm.
this podcast, was exactly about this problem of potentially stagnating innovation. And so I'm glad to hear that that's become your main area of study for the time being. I actually had a conversation as well right after that with Jason Crawford, who himself is focused on this question of why has progress
Hmm.
slowed down. He has this blog called Roots of Progress, where he's sort of assessing innovation more broadly out, not only just in science, but also in things like materials and chemistry and nuclear power and all kinds of things. Um, and they're all asking this very similar question. Eric Weinstein is also very focused on this claim. Now he's more focused on, um, I guess, his two areas of concern are like economics and physics. He says that there's a slowdown in economic productivity and in real return, as well as in physics. And I think one of the bases for us having this entire conversation about science and scientism today is that perhaps some of these dogmatic views that we have that we've sort of inherited and that we're sort of just chugging along with are limiting are contributing to this lack of innovation, to this slow growth. One of the claims contrary to that is that, well, no, actually, we it's just that for the last few hundred years, as the scientific revolution has really come into being, we have picked all the low hanging
Hmm.
fruit, and so there's no more low hanging fruit left to pick, and therefore we're going to get decreasing marginal returns on our efforts because of the fact that we've picked all the low hanging fruit. Uh, Also related to Eric Weinstein, his boss Peter
Hmm.
Thiel says that the opposite is the case. That in fact there it's only an assumption that the low hanging fruit has been picked, and actually there are more he would call them secrets to be discovered that people are simply not looking for because we've sort of given up on looking for secrets. How do you think about those claims with regard to the causes of our slowdown in innovation? Do you think that all the low hanging fruit has indeed been picked, or is it that we've simply given up on the idea that anything new and valuable can come about without tremendous amounts of effort?
It's both. Um, you know, Robert Trivers talks about evolutionary theory, and he says, back when I was a graduate student, theory was so simple that you could pretty much solve any evolutionary problem with fractions. And he says, in a sense, we're still at that point in time, which maybe isn't all the way true, but knowing just a little bit of standard math will get you a long way. Yeah, I do think it's a case that for what we're on, we have picked a large number of the low hanging fruit, but it's not as if each fruit that you pick, diminishes the number of fruit on the tree. Stuart Kaufman talks about this idea of the adjacent possible, those things that we don't necessarily know about. But it is like once you pick a fruit that is of that space, suddenly you realize, oh, there are other fruits of this type. So, it's that you discover a whole new tree from which then you pick. Usually, when we find new theories, new ideas in science, it spurs off like a whole new field of exploration. This was what Thomas Kuhn talked about when he's talking about paradigms. That one paradigm starts to slow down in its research productivity. Someone, boom, introduces something else, and then all of a sudden there's like a huge flurry of research in that area. It might be the case that over time that has kind of a space of its own, where there's like fewer and fewer points to be established or to be found out. But at the same time, I wouldn't say that our institutions are optimized in any way. So even if we have picked all the low-hanging fruit, or even if there, isn't that much else out there, I wouldn't say that we're at a point where we're really at the same levels of productivity, or at the ideal levels of productivity that could be expected. And there are ways to measure this. You can look at research output as kind of a predictable paradigm of what's to follow next. There's certain like curves like Zipf's law or the Hopf curve or something like that for looking at what we should expect in the future. And it may not be the case that we are as productive as we can be. So I think that you can actually be agnostic to this question while still trying to bolster research productivity, or just industry productivity as well.
Mm-hmm. Are you familiar with the concept of Tainter Curves?
Yeah, absolutely.
So, roughly stating, I'm going to try to be as accurate as I can be here. It basically says that you're going to get diminishing returns in terms of the benefits of complexity as the level of complexity increases, and so you get this curve that sort of bears out. Is one of the problems you think that our institutions for scientific discovery themselves have become overly complex, overly convoluted, and so there's just a lot of baggage? Is that what you're talking about when you're saying that it's not as efficient in terms of knowledge production as we used to be?
So essentially, we've scaled up in so many ways, but maybe we haven't scaled up in the right ways. What you're talking about with the Tainter curves, I think, is really important as well. This idea that as we've grown these institutions, as we've gotten them larger, we have just added on to the amount of administration that needs to be paid, the amount of what David Graeber would call bullshit that, say, faculty or researchers or students have to put up with, while as previously they didn't have all that to do. And that's certainly a problem. One thing about Tainter's hypothesis, though, was that as you get to this tail end of the curve, where the curve starts going down, what you get by a lot of institutions is what he calls scanning behavior. And that's where they start searching for alternatives. And what happens?
Meaning
what's
what?
that? Just alternatives to the system that you're in. And let me see if I can grab the book real quick. So what happens in the Tainter curve is you end up like diminishing your returns, but oftentimes, and I don't know if viewers are even going to be able to see this, is that you exit the curve and then you go into another one. But the good thing about going into another one is that all of a sudden you get all your returns back. That every once in a while these institutions have to be busted up to allow new ones to come in. And this is kind of what we were talking about with the monastic system going down. And allowing for the university system to arise. Hopefully right now there's some scanning behavior going on of people looking at different ideas for spreading knowledge, kind of like what we talked about.
Yeah, so we've talked about, ways of exiting sort of the university system. I imagine actually there will probably be some decentralized blockchain technology, maybe some DAOs
Hmm.
that are established to help conduct scientific research and coordinate scientific progress. I can imagine even something like the peer review system as it's currently instantiating being routed around. I do think peer review
Hmm.
itself is important, but I think ultimately because you have to have your work be intelligible to those who are qualified to interpret it. But the way that it's done now is certainly it's just so outdated. The processes are
Yeah,
just so old. None of this technology that we have now, as far as the internet is concerned, existed when these processes were first instituted in the late 19th and early 20th century. So why they haven't been updated is really just a matter of historical inertia at this point, and resistance by those who are benefiting
absolutely.
from it. So hopefully, all that stuff will start to get innovated around sooner rather than later. I wanted to ask you about another law, which I'm not exactly sure if some of these laws that have been coined are laws in the proper sense, or if they're just sort of colloquially laws, which is Moore's law. Moore's law is obviously a very mathematically precise, uh, and this has to do with sort of the return on on how much information we can fit into a chip, right? As time progresses, and so one of the arguments for why progress has been slowed, again, this is at least the first place where I encountered it was in Peter Thiel's Zero to One. I tend to reference him a lot these days. I wish I didn't so much, but uh, so be it. Um, it. One of the claims as to why perhaps technological progress has slowed down, and it also ties into economic progress as well, is that this tremendous success of Moore's law, the fact that we're going to get exponential returns on our ability to store information over time, means that the physical space sort of gets neglected, right? The phrase that Thiel uses is that it's become about everything's become about growth in bits rather than growth
Mm.
in atoms, and so there's less investment in sort of the more concretized aspects of particular science and technology, things like chemistry, material science, etc., because of the fact that those fields are so cost intensive. Whereas if we're just moving electrons around on chips and in doing things on computers, well, that's very, very cheap to do, and we're getting more and more returns every year. And Moore's law isn't going to reach its limits anytime soon, although at some point we are going to get into some physical limitations that people are working on that already. Um, what do you think about that claim? Do you think that Moore's law is in part to blame as to why there has been so much progress in, say, information technology, perhaps at the expense of other areas of inquiry?
Wow, that's really profound. I'd never heard of that theory before. Um, but you can kind of see how that would work, like in terms of like again talking about Tainter curves. It might be the case that yeah we get more returns right now in computer chips than we do in chemistry. But one thing that happens is that um, uh, Tainter hypothesized that oftentimes as you invest more in complexity, again, you come out of the curve. It's that, oh, wait, nope, we found the solution and you get a new curve. It may be the case that, yeah, we are neglecting certain things that we should be putting money into. Maybe we are spending on the cheap thing rather than the next thing that will actually break us out of the real problems. I'm very open to that idea. I think that's a great idea.
Hmm. Well, it's not my idea, so I'm not going to take credit for it. But that's at least one of the things that he's concerned about, because even in the realm of the physical economy, tech companies have a different structure than a lot of traditional, let's say, corporations.
Hmm.
In particular, industrial manufacturing requires large amounts of capital investment. It's very capital intensive to build factories. You also need large workforces in order to operate those factories, at least until we get some of this automation going. I hear that Elon Musk is working on some of that. But with tech companies, you can have maybe 1/100th of the size of a staff, and uh, minuscule relative to setting up a manufacturing business. Levels of initial investment and cost,
Yeah.
and including scaling. By the way, your scaling also, it does not become exceptionally cost prohibitive either.
Hmm.
Um, and yet this sort of has a uh, and so the different structure, which I would say is not even in quantity but actually is qualitatively different, means that these tech companies, in terms of their not only what they're innovating on, they're going to mostly be innovating on information technology. They're not really interested in investing in let's say new chemicals. Facebook isn't like interested in buying up chemistry startups like maybe Dow has to do. Um, they want to just build more websites and more applications, and maybe they're doing some stuff in quantum computing and trying to improve the efficiency of their chips and whatnot, or data storage.
Hmm.
But ultimately, they're sort of still confined to that narrow space. Maybe VR and some other things like that are a little bit more hardware oriented. Um, I forgot where I was going with this question.
Well, no, I see what you mean. It's this idea that, yeah, like your returns to investment are much higher right now in these fields, and that, in a sense, it's easier to focus on these things, and maybe we have neglected these other ones. I think that would be a very interesting research question to ask. How quickly was the pace of, say, materials engineering or metallurgy advancing prior to the advent of Silicon Valley, where we
Hmm.
obviously see tremendous resources going into. Um, yeah,
Well, back to my point about how these companies are qualitatively
yeah,
different. The fact that you need so few employees also means that, in terms of the economic structure and their contribution to the society in general, what you have is then you have an outsized concentration of power in a small number of
hmm,
individuals who work at these companies and operate these companies. Whereas before, the phrase used to be, what was it? What's good for Ford is good for America, or something like that. Because by their very nature, something like an auto manufacturer has to employ legions and legions of people in order to operate, and so there really is sort of a much broader base of prosperity,
hmm,
which benefits from a company like that existing in your country. Whereas someone like Facebook, not only do they have the convenience of being able to locate many of their operations overseas, they don't need to rely as much on domestic labor, at least as current labor laws are instantiated. But also, the people that are still here are able to capture a tremendous amount of wealth without really having to employ that many people. And so that wealth is not actually very widely distributed as we think it might
hmm,
be. Like if you look at the top performing stocks, if the top performing stocks are all Amazon, Netflix, Facebook, all of these tech, Alphabet, all of these tech companies, there is a real sociological and political question as to how healthy is it to have so much power and so much wealth concentrated in these very, very small companies, and I mean that in terms of human bodies involved, not their
yeah,
net, uh, not their net worth. Um, Versus more traditional companies, which, by their very nature of needing to operate more in physical space, created more broadly distributed prosperity. I think that's an interesting question that regulators and that the government should ask. I'm generally very against more regulation, but I think that's one of those areas where we might want to ask some questions about the way in which the qualitative differences between information technology companies and more traditional companies uh, is
yeah.
distorting uh, our allocation of resources
Well,
because of the fact that they're able to capture so
that
much.
that is a really interesting point, and one thing that's kind of unique to these companies is, yeah, their size, but also that they're effectively doing the same thing, which is trying to capture, um, you know, eyeball time on everyone's computers or phones. And I've kind of thought about this before. Like maybe it's like the case that, like, putting aside how much wealth he started with, which was quite a lot, that Elon Musk, he has these extremely overvalued companies that do deal with, like, physical real world systems, Tesla and SpaceX. And I think it's kind of interesting how successful they have been, given that they are like in a physical space, that they are compared to like what they're putting out overvalued. And I wonder if there isn't room for more of that.
Yeah, well, definitely. I mean, there's a lot of criticisms of Musk that that SpaceX and Tesla are essentially uh, government subsidized
Yeah.
companies, that they wouldn't really be able to exist. I mean, to the degree that they're profitable,
Mm-hmm.
which I haven't checked the last time what Tesla's status is as far as profitability. SpaceX is even less transparent because it's a private company. But that is a question. Like maybe there is a real fundamental problem with getting these companies to work in a physical
Mm-hmm.
space without severe government subsidy. And what we do about that, I'm not exactly sure, but it certainly ties into these questions of diminishing returns in the physical space.